My guest today is making the rounds on some of the biggest platforms in media today, names like Tucker Carlson and Lex Fridman, because of his ability to dispute the most common narratives that the public is being sold every single day. His name is Scott Horton. He's a multiple times best-selling author, and this episode is exciting. Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Here is Scott Horton. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Scott Horton. Scott, thanks so much for making the time today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Okay, there's a handful of directions I want to take this conversation, but here's where we'll start. If you were to step back from any of the regional conflicts that people are paying attention to right now and just say, here is the biggest thing about foreign policy in the US that the public misunderstands, what comes to mind?
I think the overall posture of the United States and the world, I think most people really do know this, but there's a bit of cognitive dissonance about it. So, at any football game, everyone will agree that we're number one. America is the world's superpower. And as George Bush Sr. said, what we say goes. On the other hand, America's not an empire. Oh, all we do is, go and defend people and try to spread freedom and do, Superman things like save kittens from trees because we know we're good people. So obviously whatever we're doing is good, and because it's a democracy and the democracy chooses the best leaders to express the will of the people in the thing. So obviously whatever we're doing over there in Eurasia probably has something to do with helping flood victims, right? Or something gentle. Or if not, then yes, violence as a desperate last-ditch effort to save goodness from evil, right? When the fact of the matter is that if you just, I'm from Texas, but just pretend you're from anywhere else in the world and just look at the situation, right? Mm-hmm. What happened is very clear. We had a bipolar world during the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, where everybody with any power anyway was answerable either to Washington or to Moscow. And you had the unaligned countries in the third world, but they didn't have any power to exercise anyway, or they would have been taken over and integrated into one or the other of the two major blocs. But then the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and their Warsaw Pact dissolved. All of Eastern and Central Europe were liberated. And not only did it cease to exist, but the Russian Federation that was left as the rump of the old Soviet Empire had just, 1/100th of the power of the USSR. Their influence in the world was just decimated. So this then became what was called at the time the Unipolar Moment. That was what the neoconservative, thinker, writer Charles Krauthammer called it. And the idea was that, and even then it's the word moment is built into the thing, you notice, right? The idea is that now, with no one in our way, we can remake the world how we want it to be, and for a while. Because one of the things about the world and the way we want it to be is we want the world to adopt what Bill Clinton called, and I don't mean in the most literal sense, but I mean in the Bill Clintonian, very watered down center-left Democrat type sense. We wanted them to adopt free markets and democracy. Well, compared to communism, that means that we are forcing, or we are attempting to help the former communist bloc countries become wealthy, right? The Chinese were starving by the tens of millions until finally Mao died, and they sent Milton Friedman over there to convince essentially the right wing of the Communist Party to abandon Marxism and adopt property rights and prices. Otherwise, you're dead. And so they did. So what does that mean? That means China is now an incredibly wealthy country that can afford its own navy, right? Which means that unipolar moment was a moment and it's over. The real problem, one of the real problems we have, first of all, is trying to enforce this global hegemony in the first place. But then in the second place, it's the refusal to admit that our power is spent. That in fact, the stewards of American empire after the end of the Cold War, they blew our whole wad. You could have never had a more incompetent generation of leaders than the Clintons, the Bushes, McCain, and Biden, and the people that rule the consensus since the end of the last Cold War. Our debt just finally crossed $37 trillion, paying $1 trillion a year in interest on the debt, more than we're even paying for the empire, more than we're even paying for Social Security and Medicare. We're paying just an interest to sovereign bondholders, to central banks elsewhere in the world to prop up our phony currency that our government continues to expand just so they can pay for all this big government, for all this war. And right at a time when you have other countries in the world who are now wealthy enough to essentially guarantee their own independence. And this is, you have, just as you would have with any other world empire, the more we squeeze, the more they squirm, right? And so this is the invention of the BRICS, is attempts by the medium-ranked powers of the world to combine together to ignore us, to use each other's currencies in all their major transactions to try to find a way to neutralize American hegemonic power, including economic power that we hold over the world. You might have heard of this. Anybody crosses us for any reason whatsoever, on go the sanctions, on go, direct economic warfare against essentially any country in the world. And we talk about how bad communism is for Venezuela, but a huge part about what's wrong with Venezuela is that America has outlawed any multinational firm from doing any business with them whatsoever. So you say communists can't run an oil industry? Of course they can't. But they could hire a multinational firm to come in and run it for them, but we won't allow that. We'll put any sanctions on any company that comes in there to help them. So then we have a refugee crisis of Venezuelan gangsters and murderers and rapists all across our country, and wonder why. It's because the USA is using its power to destroy that country for daring to step out of line. And just as simple as that, the communists, and believe me, we could spend the rest of the show probably on this. It's just how they took one of the most diverse economies in Latin America and destroyed it, right? Through central planning. It was before Maduro ever got there. Hugo Chavez had completely ruined Venezuela. But then what does America do? We come and try to set the whole thing on fire after that. We try to make it worse to punish them. And then where, unlike when you're talking about destroying Middle Eastern nations, where all those refugees run to Europe, these refugees run here and are, really, if you look at all the worst crimes of illegal immigrants, or many of the worst crimes of illegal immigrants in the United States over the last, decade or so, it's Venezuelans. When they talk about gangsters taking over entire apartment complexes and all this kinds of things, those are Venezuelan gangs. What are they even doing here? They're, America's exercising this kind of power over their country for the worse. Just as you would expect if you asked John McCain to make a decision. What do you think he's going to do? He's going to ruin it, whatever it is. And the same for the Bushes and the Clintons and the Bidens and whoever, these people this whole time. So they've taken ultimate power beginning, if we start at the end of the last Cold War, they've got a decade until the new millennium. And what are they going to do? And they're going to ruin everything. That's what they're going to do. Here we are 30 years later, and the charts of whether America's on the right track and whether we're doing the right thing and whether people can afford to feed their families and all of these things, all of these indicators are down. And this is before the big crash. This is still bubble times before the next big correction. It's really bad. And it shows that, I don't know what it shows about whether they care about us or not. I think they don't. But it definitely proves that if this is their best effort, then our national government needs to be just completely defenestrated and demonetized and taken down 99 pegs back to its constitutional role, and then let a free society handle these problems on our own without their leadership.
I think a lot of my viewers are nodding along with you in agreement as you make that case. I was in Colombia a few times in like 2017, 18, and 19. And even then, the flood of Venezuelans coming to Colombia just to get out of the country, right, to begin wherever they would go next. Many didn't stay in Colombia, but it was a major point of conversation in a couple of the cities I was in. So just to recap some of this, migrating out of the USSR, USA era, right, into the unipolar moment. And suddenly the US found themselves as the sole superpower in the world and decided, therefore, to reshape the globe in their image effectively, right? Combat communism wherever it be found, turn these countries into democratic capitalist societies, and lifting people out of poverty as a consequence. But as a consequence, once you're lifted out of poverty, you want to fly the coop. You don't want the control that was imposed on you that maybe lifted you out in the first place. And now we have powerful countries, effectively America's created competitors in the form of China, the BRICS nations, as you mentioned. These nations now have control. They have extensive resources. They have leverage, and now they have alliances, right, to combat what was the sole superpower. And that's now the world that we live in today. And it's almost like we're at this tipping point where we're learning whether or not the new powers and the new alliances are more powerful than the sole superpower that's dominated for the last 40 years. Is that a decent summary?
Yeah, in a way, although I don't think they're really trying to challenge our military power. I mean, China clearly is building up enough of a navy to keep us away. I don't think that they're trying to really create, the kind of navy that we have to rule the seven seas and all of that, the way that we have. But yes, I think, I saw, I don't know, maybe it was just a YouTube comment or something that said that, Israel is going to destroy the American empire. And I thought, oh, well, finally we figured out they're good for something, right? Like, it's too bad that Israel had to convince us to blow our own brains out this way and destroy our society so that we don't have the power to control anybody else's anymore. We could have just listened to Ron Paul and just gave up the empire because we're not supposed to be an empire anyway. James Monroe said, you stay out of our hemisphere, we'll stay out of yours. Let's just do that. Right? I'm in my old age, I'm getting weak on my ideological commitment to libertarianism here. I will go ahead and concede to you that maybe we could even extend war guarantees to Canada and Mexico. But then again, I don't know. The Brits ruled Canada for the first half of this country's existence. No problem. The Spanish, the French, whoever ruled in Mexico. Maybe I don't really care about that. I guess if it was Russia and China and they wanted to build military bases and deploy nuclear weapons in our neighboring states, okay, you talk me into intervention then. But otherwise, it's very convenient, right? It's a great self-justification from the denizens of Washington and New York City, right? That if they weren't holding the whole world together, it would tear itself apart. Right. If it wasn't us, it would be Russia or China, or worse, it would be no one, and no one would be in charge, and then just everyone would fight. Right. And the thing is, that's what every government official thinks about their job. Right. Is that good thing they're here because if it wasn't for them. But I think those questions ought to always remain in dispute and undecided, on a permanent basis here. I don't know why. If you ask people why they support the United Nations, they'll say, well, because we want people to be able to get together and talk these things out. There is no real world government. So at least we want the national governments to be able to sit in a hall together and negotiate instead of just fighting. And that's what people will tell you is what they think the point of it is, right? Not as a fig leaf for American power, but as a way for countries to resolve issues without American or anybody else's intervention, right? And I think, this is kind of maybe cliche or whatever, but there's this old speech by William Jennings Bryan, who I know was a commie for his day, but whatever. He's an old Democrat a long time ago, and he was against World War I. The guy with the cross of gold speech, ironically, and all that. We demand inflationary money now was his speech. But he gave this other speech. I guess it was just called Behold a Republic. And he goes on and on about, behold our great country, America, where we do things this, that, and the other way, right? And part of it is he boasts that we are not weighed down by our armaments industry the way that the Europeans are, and that we're not weighed down by militarism, sucking the life force out of our society through the merchants of death and all of these things. Again, this is in the pre-Woodrow Wilson era. And he's saying, behold a republic that, this is poorly paraphrased, that hosts peace conferences, that resolves wars instead of starting them, right? And now this is not an America that would promise to pay Egypt $3 billion a year to pretend to not hate Israel. right? But this is an America that would host a conference for them to hash out their differences without making promises on behalf of this country that shouldn't have the power to intervene over there either way. But if you guys need Washington to serve as Geneva and you can come and meet here and host a peace conference, then let's do that. You know, to Trump's credit, I think it's probably true. There are, reports like this that when India and Pakistan started fighting, I don't know if ISI did it or not, but there was like a group of Pakistani terrorists, LET types, killed some, I think, Indian tourists in Kashmir. And this started off some pretty bad fighting, dogfighting and missile attacks across the border. And evidently Trump picked up the phone and said, listen, just stop. I don't want this. You don't want this. And I insist that you quit it. Now, as far as I know, I don't think it was reported he made any specific threat. What's he going to do? They both have atom bombs too. Right. The worst he could actually threaten them is like, hey, this could jeopardize our friendship going forward and our economic relationship and something, right? But I don't even think he specifically threatened either of them with sanctions. He said, hey, your good friend America wants you to chill out. And they did. And evidently he did the same thing with the border dispute between Cambodia and Thailand a couple of weeks ago, where he just said, listen, the world doesn't want to see fighting right now. Now, maybe this is just because he wants his peace prize. He sure killed a hell of a lot of people. He's bombed Somalia more even than Barack Obama, which is, I think, takes away from these phone calls. But I think you don't have to be a world hegemon. America can be a major economic power in the world without being the major dominant military force in Eurasia. And I think Trump could still do essentially those same things. Pick up the telephone and say, listen, guys, if the borders need adjustment, we're going to figure this out at a table. Nobody wants to see this violence. And after all, like, even if you're talking about relatively poor countries like Cambodia and Thailand, everybody has so much to lose in violent conflict, especially in this day and age with the technology that we have of fully automatic everything plus drones and the rest. It's just a nightmare. We should have all had learned this lesson by the end of the American Civil War, if not World War I, that you just can't have mechanized powers fighting each other, dude. It's just too ugly. Look at what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
And look at how much Ukraine and Russia both have lost in waging this war. It ought to be a severe lesson to everyone that whatever minor territorial gain is almost certainly not worth the expenditure to make it. And so that doesn't solve every problem. But then again, American power doesn't solve every problem either. I mean, you might have noticed, as Martin Luther King said then, that America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. So you can say that it's all for good, but it's like a drunken, murderous cop going around at the very best, accidentally starting fires everywhere he goes, crashing into cars, killing families and shooting the wrong guy in the back and the rest.
What would you say to somebody, Scott? You must hear this counterpoint as vague. I'll make it kind of vague here, but the world's a dangerous place. And we'd love it to be a peaceful utopia where everybody got along and had free trade agreements and we understood the value of doing business with each other exceeded trying to control someone else's resources, right? We should just figure out how to do this harmoniously. But in reality, people don't operate like that. We compete, right? There's always conflict over territory, and there always has been as long as there's been written history of human beings. We compete for territory and resources. And therefore, the world is a dangerous place. So we have to be dangerous. And there's a cost of the standard of living that we've achieved in the West, becoming the global superpower. And that cost isn't pretty. We don't like to acknowledge it, but it's the cost of the quality of life that we all want. You must hear that. What would you make of a statement like that?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, and no fault of yours, but it's even kind of unclear the way that you stated it. Wait, this is why we have our great standard of living, or this is at the cost of our great standard of living that we would have if we weren't doing this, which I think is correct. I think people very falsely assume that, well, war's good for the economy, and without the empire, we'd have to pay market rates for bananas and all of that. And so, boy, we wouldn't be able to live the way we live if we weren't ruthlessly exploiting the rest of the planet this way. That's all just completely false. I mean, we waste trillions of dollars on militarism, far more than we spend on foreign oil or foreign timber or foreign anything, right? The cost of our Navy alone for guaranteeing essentially free security on the high seas or socialized security costs on the high seas for American corporations to have their goods produced overseas in lower wage countries, the expense of American jobs and all of that. It's far outweighed, right? Like any benefit even of the cheaper wages there to other consumers, if not those who would have been employed, is already completely wasted by the cost of that Navy. That's, just constantly churning, burning hundreds of billions of dollars a year, accomplishing nothing mostly. So no, it's just not worth it at all. This is, as Garrett Garrett said, in the American empire, everything goes out. Nothing comes back. And cheap labor, that's a marginal thing that helps some companies. That's not America's overall economy is dependent on overseas cheap labor. If you listen to Americans, they would like to be employed, please. Right? Mm-hmm. They would rather be the expensive labor here than exploit cheap labor there, when it comes down to that. And then also noticed, and this is, again, not your fault, it's just the reality that you're reflecting in your question. There was a very important word that was missing from your statement. And, 2 words, sorry. To us. The world is a very dangerous place to us. Was missing because no, it's not a dangerous place to us. We have 2 weak and friendly neighbors, 5,000 hydrogen bombs and 2 massive oceans and the world's most powerful Navy. And actually, the world is not a dangerous place to the United States of America at all, unless you count blowback from our own government's terrorist mercenaries who sometimes kill thousands of us as revenge for our Israel-centric foreign policies in the Middle East. Otherwise, we're friends with every single power in Europe. And including we're some kind of frenemies with the Russians. This is nothing like the Cold War against the Soviet Union, as bad as that was, right? We still have trade relationships. We still share rockets. They boost our guys to the International Space Station on a regular basis, still, even during this war, right? At worst, we're economic competitors with China. We're not really enemies with China, unless Taiwan, which is not even a state in China's union, is a state in our union. Which is completely preposterous, right? So the world's a dangerous place because, I don't know, Myanmar and Bhutan might get into a border dispute. Well, that sucks for them. That's a very dangerous world for Bhutan. Too bad for them that they live in that weird coast east of India there, right? What the hell does that have to do with me? Nothing. Why in the world the Texans have to pay out of our pocket interest on the debt to Chinese bondholders and South Korean bondholders to pay for militarism to pretend to keep the peace between Myanmar and Bhutan? Are they even neighbors? They're pretty close. It's completely insane. And if the American people had a choice in any of this, we wouldn't do it. Just the same as even in the world wars. They couldn't get the American population of fighting age males to go volunteer, even to fight Hitler and Tojo. Even after Pearl Harbor, they had to conscript, that is, enslave by force, 16 million men to go and fight. Because even when it's World War II, the veterans of World War I didn't want to send their sons. Yeah, Hitler is bad. That sounds like a Czechoslovakia problem. That sounds like a Stalin problem. Why should we go save Stalin anyway? Are you sure we want to save communism from fascism? Because it's that much of a superior system? Is that it? Or what? Even in the worst case scenario, you have to enslave Americans to go and participate in this thing. The rest of the time, you have to lie to us. George W. Bush apparently believed, he told Pat Robertson, we would have 0 casualties in Iraq War II. I mean, we had 200 in Iraq War I, where we didn't try to go to the capital city and overthrow the dictator and install a new regime and lord an occupation army over the population for years. But he prayed. He told Pat Robertson, we won't have any casualties. It'll be easy. And he told the American people, imagine September 11th, only this time Saddam Hussein has given Al-Qaeda chemical weapons. To try to just outright lying as bad as he possibly could to scare your mom and dad into supporting aggressive war. And they wouldn't do it. The focus groups say they won't do it until you threaten them. In fact, even the chemical weapons thing. didn't work. They said, we can't wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, to be a mushroom cloud over an American city. Colin Powell, George W. Bush, and Condoleezza Rice, all three used that focus group, workshopped phraseology that came from the White House Iraq group that was run by Karen Hughes, the TV news lady, and Karl Rove, the spin meister, right? None of these people, they practice. What do we have to lie to the American people to get them to let us do this? Mm-hmm. Saddam Hussein could nuke your hometown. Then you'd regret not letting us preempt his attack, wouldn't you? And only then can you get the American people to go for this kind of thing.
Let me ask you a question, because you made a statement that I've picked up on a lot recently. You said, as Americans, if we had a choice, we wouldn't do this, and you were kind of relating that to many of the military endeavors around the world. And, I've heard that a lot lately. And if we had a choice, I want to sort of hang on to that for a minute. And let me ask you about state creep, state capitalism, but state creep into private lives in America. And I think if you go back a generation too, when, the Americans lifted China out of poverty to some extent, the idea was if we liberalize the Chinese economy, they'll become more like America's. They'll become more democratic and capitalist. And to a degree, that's been true. They've got their sort of capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as they call it. It's this hybrid model, communist, capitalist. It's more like a corporate structure, actually, right? That's how I see the Chinese economy. But my point is this: if we look at some of the decisions out of the American administration just over the last year, we see more and more involvement in private business, whether it's the blocking of the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel merger until the American government was awarded the golden share in that transaction. So they can now appoint board members to U.S. Steel. They can influence operations.
God, that sounds like Russia. I didn't even know that.
That's the point, right?
The U.S. government got the controlling share in that deal?
It's a concept called a golden share. So yes, Trump can appoint a board member to the U.S. board. They can prevent
a board member. Wow, it's not a Philip Drew administrator. Have you ever read Philip Drew?
I haven't. No.
Okay,
no.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's just they can prevent influence American operations, prevent them from shutting down American facilities, influence who they sell steel to abroad, all this stuff. Wow. It's very sort of state control. And like a different take on the NVIDIA deal recently, where now NVIDIA is kicking back 15% the sale of certain chips that they sell to China, all of this. And these are novel deals in America, but they're the course of business in China. This is normal, right? Golden shares are appointed to the Chinese administration all the time, right? They have massive influence in megacorps in that country. My question is this: the idea a generation ago was if we liberalize China, it will become more like America. If we reflect on the trajectory of America today, it's almost like we're heading that direction, right? Maybe we're going to meet in the middle somewhere, but which is more true, right? And what's your take on this, Scott?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I used to be in the 1990s like a New World Order conspiracy guy, where the grand design, as G. Edward Griffin called it, from the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, the old Birch guy, the theory was that America and Russia will become more and more like each other and merge together and to create a one world army, essentially a one world white army of the North. Right. Russia would join NATO, and it would be the former enemies, the two opposites, now the synthesis in the middle would be the new order. And so that's what we would always, I would always joke back then is, you see, as they become more like us under Boris Yeltsin, we become more like them under Bill Clinton, right? With his totalitarian regime that they were foisting on us then. And of course, what's funny is, and this is my most recent book, is I was totally wrong about that. The American idea of the New World Order was the Russians are going to kiss our feet, or worse, that's putting it very politely. And we're not going to share any power with them whatsoever. We're not bringing them into NATO and all that. So, the first two chapters of my book are basically about how I didn't know what I was talking about when I was 22. But that part of it where as you call it, the state creep, where we get, this was the John Birchers. They were the most right-wing conservatives in America, but what really got them kicked out of polite society was their opposition to the Vietnam War. Robert Welch said, why are we fighting the commies in Vietnam when we're empowering them here? And we're creating a total state here. Whether you have a Republican or a Democrat in charge of the thing, ultimately, what's wrong with communism? It's too much government control over free people's decision-making, man. Why are we doing this to ourselves in the name of thwarting it overseas? When, in fact, this was the justification for the Cold War from William F. Buckley, the founder of the National Review. He had written back in 1952, we must accept a totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores, even with Truman at the reins of it all, in order to fight the Cold War, to stop the Soviet Union. And Robert Welch said, no, nuts to that. What's the point of winning the Cold War against the Reds if we have to create a totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores to do so? Forget it, dude. And by the way, communism is a real idiot way to run an economy and an empire anyway. It's not going to work anyway. They can't afford to take over the world. They can't even run their own society or the damn at all. And so it was threat inflation, and honest right-wingers could see that at the time. Murray Rothbard and other libertarian writers and thinkers said the same thing, that the Soviet Union was a paper tiger, essentially, built up as a threat in order to justify American militarism in response, supposed response. But now, as far as China goes, I hear this said a lot, and there is something to this, right? That I guess Milton Friedman, and in fact, I heard John Mearsheimer talked about this on the Tucker Carlson show a couple of weeks ago, that he says, he's from the same realist school as Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a Rockefeller guy, after all. But he goes, the big was always a couple of clicks to the right of me on everything. But I debated him one time about China. And I said, it's the most idiot thing in the world to build up China, to give them most favored nation status, to essentially have a government policy bent toward not just teaching them Milton Friedman economics, but like helping them, like having policies geared around toward helping American companies offshore from here to go there instead, to build them up to be the industrial power of the world as we deindustrialize and offshore all that to them, just on the assumption, as Brzezinski thought, that, as you said, they'll become a democracy and then they'll just be another Western nation like Japan is, right? A de facto Western nation and, one of our allies. And we'll go from there, essentially, without recognizing that, no, they'll be wealthy enough to maintain their independence from us, and they will seek to defend their own interests, not just go along with ours, right? I mean, what is it about Boris Yeltsin? It's that he's weak and drunk. That's what it is about him. But if he had the power, like, say, his hand-appointed successor, Vladimir Putin, to assert independence and maintain it, he's going to do that. Of course he would. Any state that has the ability to maintain their political independence from any major power is going to do so if they can. And so I don't think that Mearsheimer would have recommended, encouraging Marxism in China to keep them starving to death, right? But that doesn't mean we had to do everything we could to build them up. But here's the thing, though, that people miss out on that, is we're not supposed to be the world empire in East Asia anyway. And so it shouldn't really matter to us if they become the regional hegemon. I mean, what are you saying? That only 99% of the Pacific Ocean is an American lake, but 1% of it is not? Okay, that's maybe a threat to the U.S. Navy's hegemony in the Pacific. It's not a threat to the United States of America, right? You have to blow that way out of proportion. Then they want to extrapolate and say, well, if China's may take Taiwan at some point, which they might, they've built up a naval force capable of doing so anyway. But it's their lost province. It's 90 miles off their shore, not ours. Imagine China is saying they guarantee the independence of Catalina Island off the coast of Los Angeles. We nuke Beijing. I'm not going to put up with that whatsoever at all. And I have to say, and for the people in Taiwan listening to this, I'm very sorry, but F you. Figure out your own problems. If you want to be more like Hong Kong than the Donbass, then I suggest you negotiate. Because it's been America's official policy for 50 years. 53. That Taiwan is part of China. And we will not guarantee your independence. Now China has the ability to take Taiwan back by force. Are you willing to have a nuclear war? Trade your hometown, your home state, our entire civilization in an H-bomb war with China over their sovereignty over Taiwan? Oh, I heard they got some microchips there. Oh, yeah? Well, then move the factory to Austin then. Pack it up. We got really big airplanes nowadays. You could pack up a whole factory. You ever seen those planes that they have that they ship other planes in?
Yeah.
Right? Like it's a plane that you can ship the wings for a 787 inside this other thing. Yeah. You just put the factory in that and move it out of there then. Why'd you put, dire economic interests in such a dangerous security situation in the first place? It sounds like somebody else's fault and somebody else's problem, right? And then, China may be able to take that over and get a hold of the microchips. They'll have those same microchips in 5 years anyway through their own research or whatever, right? In that Moore's law, they're going to figure it out soon enough. You can't really keep that technology from them overall anyway. And quite frankly, they have somewhere, between 300 and 600 hydrogen bombs, which means if we get into a real war with them, we are at a real risk of losing our entire civilization over something that couldn't possibly be of a severe interest of ours. And then we're supposed to say, if they threaten Taiwan, then whatever, 1, 2, skip a few. Now they're going to take South Korea and Japan and Australia. Yeah, or maybe not, right? Like, give me a break. Why in the world should we believe that that's true?
That's
right?
ridiculous.
So in other words, this Thucydides trap where the old empire has to fight the rising new empire is only a trap if you're the idiot old empire who won't just give it up, right? You don't have to fight China. Just come home. We're not supposed to be the world empire anyway. It's impossible to have a limited constitutional republic and a world empire anyway. This whole thing is illegal by our constitution. And so just forget it. And then that way, if China wants to get into it with Myanmar and Bhutan, well, that's their problem, but it's not ours. And I think, and then here's one other thing that people always forget about that too, is in this era where China started really getting rich, we had Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama, and for that matter, Trump and Biden too. But especially like these three were in charge of the world empire during that time. And I guess Clinton and Jiang Zemin, they had a pretty good relationship, I guess, essentially. And W. Bush wasn't, that hawkish on China. But at the same time, Bill Clinton too, but especially W. Bush, his foreign policy in the name of spreading democracy, of launching violent, aggressive wars, and doing multiple color-coded revolutions, which are just coup d'etats dressed up as popular revolutions, and his essentially unrelenting pressure of regime change against anybody who was out of line of the American empire, that put everybody off of America and what we're doing and what we're like and whether we're trustworthy and all of these things in a way far beyond we could just measure with some kind of graph or something. His father had said back at the dawn of the New Order during Iraq War I, he says, the world trusts us with this power because they know that we are good people and that we are responsible and that we will do the right thing with our power, right? Which was nonsense, but it was a lot closer to the truth than after his son just slaughtered millions of people for nothing, and all in the name of freedom and democracy and the Declaration of Independence and all of these things. And it put just in the overall market, put severe pressure against everything Western and everything especially American. From, at the very start of the Iraq War, Egyptians who all drink Pepsi because they don't drink. It's a Muslim country, no alcohol. Everybody drinks soda. They all drink Pepsi. They all stopped drinking Pepsi in, I forgot where it was. It was Levi's jeans were the huge fad in, I guess it was in Iraq and in pre-invasion times or whatever it was, they just all stopped wearing Western clothes, drinking Western sodas and all of that kind of thing. I'll never forget this preacher who used to be a regular on Fox News. I can't remember his name anymore. This is a long time ago, but he did the Sean Hannity show, and he had just gotten back from I'm not exactly sure. I guess Southeast Asia. Not China, but somewhere in Southeast Asia. And he goes on the Hannity show, and this is like in 2004 or something, like the very worst Hannity of all in that era, the World War II era. And the guy says, Sean, we have to stop the war. We have to get out of Iraq right now. And Sean Hannity goes, what? What are you talking about? And he goes, I just got back from Asia, or maybe he was still there, like via satellite or whatever. I think I just got back from Asia, and I'm a missionary, and I've had the worst luck and the worst time recruiting people to Christianity of my entire career, my entire lifetime. And you know what they say to me? They say, Jesus, Christianity, isn't that the religion of the Americans that invaded Iraq? Forget it. Get away from me. I don't want to hear it. That's what you are. That's what your society represents. Lies and aggressive war and murderous violence against women and children. You guys are devils. Why would I want to believe in the same religion as you? Now, if that was, you know what I mean? Like that's just one small part of it. Think overall now, extrapolate out the opportunity costs in terms of not just American corporations' ability to export a USA brand name crap to the world, but just overall global sentiment about our country, who we are and what we mean. There was a time where you could talk about the Declaration of Independence with a straight face. You could talk about freedom and liberty and free markets and these things, and people wouldn't just break out laughing at you. These were things that America did stand for. Does anyone believe that now when we have the most corrupt economy in the world? Does anyone believe that now when we launch all the aggressive wars? We killed 4 million people in the last 25 years, at least. Maybe 5 now if you count the Ukraine war. 37 million, 40 million people, forced from their homes, aiding and abetting the genocide against the Palestinians. America's government is evil, and the people of the world rightfully reject its illegitimate authority. So now, back to China. And never mind their ruling regime, but them too. But also just the population of the country. When we say, you guys ought to have a limited government like ours. You guys ought to get your government out of big business and have free markets like ours. You guys ought to have a better Bill of Rights and process for those accused of crimes or civil infractions in your society. You should protect property rights better. You should be less of an aggressive threat against your island neighbors. How could any of them take us seriously? We clearly couldn't possibly mean it, right? In fact, they say any sovereign nation has the unalienable natural right. I read this in the New York Times today. And Russia refuses to accept Ukraine's natural right to independence, sovereignty, and a military alliance with the West. Oh, okay. I'm pretty sure it was the military alliance with the West part that got them, right? And they go, no, it's Ukraine's sacred, unalienable right to choose to join NATO if they want to. Well, the Solomon Islands go, well, we're thinking about getting into a military relationship with China. And America says, not unless you want to be killed, because we'll kill every single last one of you before we let you join in an alliance with China. 10-4, roger that. Your sacred, unalienable right ends where American interests begin. Is there anyone out of the 8 billion of us on this planet who don't understand that to be true? That America is nothing but Bill Clinton, the face-biting rapist, church-burning murderer, liar, W. Bush, aggressive warrior. You know, they call Saddam Hussein Hitler. They say it's the Russians who are demanding to be appeased. Does anyone outside of North America see it that way? I severely doubt it. And I think that and I'm sorry because I'm rambling, but to your actual point, if America was not this way, if America had elected Ron Paul and Harry Brown and Rand Paul and good libertarians to run this society or run this government and take charge of this foreign policy in this time, then I think that we would have the moral authority to criticize China for the things about their society that absolutely do deserve criticism. Same thing for I guess I said this in the book. Take a look at Libya, Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. These countries all have horrible problems, right? Even Iran. They have horrible problems. They have horrible tyrannies. They have, in East Africa and in Kurdistan, they have this tradition of female circumcision, which is a euphemism for absolute butchery, right? They have, in Pashtun culture, the way that essentially it's normalized that they have sex with each other's sons and little brothers instead of their sisters, right? Each other's sisters, right? And that's who you date, is like girls in your neighborhood. No, they got it all wrong. The rest of humanity figured this out about male-female relations. The Pashtuns, yeah, not so much, right? And yet, out of all of these states, the very worst things about them is the United States of America and our wars there, the mass killing that we have done, the corrupt butchers that we have installed in power as their police chiefs and mayors. You want to talk about child rape in Afghanistan? The Taliban would hang a guy from the neck for that kind of thing. America spent 20 years making those people the police chief and the mayor and the governor. Okay? That's the reality. They're the worst things. You talk about Iran, their morality police, lording it over the women of Tehran who would rather live like New Yorkers, apparently. Okay, but the worst thing about Iran is the economic devastation of America's crippling sanctions and maximum pressure policy against their country for the last 25 years. A refusal to allow them to trade and engage with the rest of the world and make money and take care of their own society. And that's a country that we haven't bombed off the face of the earth. That's one where we didn't do a regime change. Well, we bombed them a bit. But I'm talking about, even in the lead up to this war, is still the worst thing about Iran is USA. By far the worst thing about Somalia, Iraq, Palestine, Syria is us.
Let me ask you. So I'm curious about your optimism of turning this cycle around, or if that's even possible. And there's a couple of directions we could go here, but when I think about you referenced America encouraging a country like China to have a U.S.-centric constitution, and the beauty of the U.S. Constitution, from my perspective, was how it limits the power of any one person. That was the original point. I think you could dispute that if it still stands today. We talked about some of the state creep already. I think today there's now 800 troops in D.C. kind of taking over the Capitol and co-opting the police force. And I don't, when I talk about the NVIDIA deal, the Nippon Steel deal, the DC occupation, whatever, I'm not throwing shade at our current president, because I think once precedent is set, it's just picked up and carried forward by whoever comes next. And these sort of power grabs just become the new normal. But being that that's the case, where do you stand on, you're in Texas, my wife's from Texas, my family holds Canadian and American passports. We spent about half our life in Indonesia. We just want options, right? I got 3 little boys. We're thinking about where's the best place to raise a family today, where they could be surrounded by as much opportunity as I was growing up, right? I was really fortunate to grow up in the era I did. What's your take though, long term, whether we get into are we truly in the remaining sunset years of the American empire, and what's that look like? Or, you mentioned kind of the accidental empire argument a couple times, right? America never intended on being an empire. This wasn't in the plans originally. That's sort of a George Friedman take. And he would also argue that, despite things looking pretty bad right now, we're in our adolescence. These are growing pains. America's trying to figure out how to operate in its new capacity, and our brightest days are still ahead of us.
Yeah, I'll buy that too. I'm a Morning in America guy. If everybody would just listen to me, right? During the crash of '08, I talked with the great historian Robert Higgs. You love this guy, by the way, if you're not familiar. You talk about state creep. He's the guy that wrote the book Crisis and Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of America's Government. And he's the guy that coined the term the ratchet effect. He said every time there's a crisis, the government grows in power and ratchets down on our liberties. And then when the crisis abates, the handle of the ratchet goes back, but the part that turns the bolt does not. right? And so our freedoms remain lost and the growth of government stays. And then it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, right? So that's his book, Crisis in Leviathan. Anyway, brilliant guy, great libertarian economist and historian. But so he told me in the crash of '08 that it's Higgs, Robert Higgs. He told me in the crash of '08 that, like, look, man, so what's happened here is we've had this massive financial crash. But you have to remember that, and this is Austrian theory, right? The business cycle theory is that the boom and the bust is caused by the artificial creation of new bank credit and government just expanding the money supply itself as well, leading to way more new money being created than new wealth being created, right? And then that's what leads to these bubbles, and then the great crashes. But the point being that the property in the country is all still very real, and including a lot of the stuff that is built up during the bubble. Now, a lot of times people go broke, but then their actual, valuable assets get bought up in bankruptcy court and live to survive to produce further goods and services going forward. So, for example, if you have a quarry or you have a trucking business or whatever, you might lose everything in the crash, but those trucks don't just drop dead. They're still there, right? As long as they're not allowed to just go to rust. If someone else can get their hands on them, those trucks are still there. And so this country, zoom out, is lousy with gigantic freeways and warehouses and machine tools and universities full of brains, full of engineering knowledge and all of these things, all of our electric plants, all of our dams, all of our infrastructure that we already have, that's all still here. And so the idea that we could ever suffer something like the Great Depression of the 1930s again is impossible, because there's too much actual real wealth and capacity of however many tens of millions of different businesses to provide goods and services to people throughout this economy that just can't go away. You will have, Lehman Brothers come and go and this kind of thing. And you'll have regular people, of course, who get caught up in those things, whether through any fault of their own or not. We will obviously have to suffer through the booms and all the inflationary pricing during the booms, and plus the crashes and all the terrible results from the crash. The regular people get screwed coming and going in this system. But overall, all that has been built ain't going away. So, I really think, again, that the empire itself is a net loss. And we are just wasting so much money on militarism and imperialism and just on talent and on brawn, for that matter. Just think of our 1 million man army. All those guys should be out doing something productive, and contributing to the economy, instead of you take your most capable people and you put them in charge of destroying all the excess wealth of everybody else. And it's completely stupid. The whole thing is so upside down. And so I think, I'm not an economist. I don't know exactly how it would be, but I'm fairly certain that if we just brought our empire home, we downsized our military by 90%, we downsized our federal government by 90%, and just fired all those bureaucrats, and including got rid of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and all of the federal entitlements and all the regulations, commerce, education, energy. Well, energy holds the nukes. Somebody has to hold the nukes other than the Pentagon, please. But other than that, you just decimate the national government. We just don't need them. And then I think we would have a severe correction for a few months, right? Let prices seek level. Let all these federal government bums get real jobs, and maybe living out their live stream. You got some guy designing and redesigning and redesigning and redesigning the same machine gun over and over again in the Pentagon's basement right now. Maybe you put him to work out there. He'll design something that'll really help improve the standard of living for his fellow humans. You know what I mean? Give these people a chance to actually be productive. And I think American society would just be fine. And some prices would crash. You might find out that, oh, wow, your house really is not worth $500,000. That was all, federal government monetary finagling. And so, there would be corrections. And yet, what is it? What do we think? That government employment brings prosperity? That government management and regulation, that these people, all of these tax feeders, are ultimately the ones that make us prosperous, when No, they don't. They're the ones who, at the very best, they're helping to create a level playing field where others can manage in the market. But mostly that's not their job, is it? Right? Mostly they are a giant weight around the rest of our necks. So I think that, I don't know exactly what George Friedman was saying about all this, but I believe that if you just, this is something that Ron Paul always teaches. I guess maybe it is the only thing that I do believe in, is that freedom works. And if you just let it work, it'll be fine. But you got to give it a chance.
Yeah. And, as we hear more and more, I mean, every week there's a new sort of tariff adjacent headline. And it always struck me as ironic, that the sort of freedom voting MAGA supporters are cheering on the tariff strategy as if a government has ever regulated itself to prosperity. And that was kind of the message behind these, right? It was like, we used to be rich because of tariffs. It's like, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. America became the greatest economy in the world because of free market capitalism, the lack of government regulation. That's what did it. To think we're going to regulate America to prosperity is a complete misunderstanding of the most basic economics. Totally. But as we began this interview, you're like, there's the reality and then there's a story that we're told, right? And those two things are very decoupled. And as long as the story is controlled and the narrative is fed to the public that's driving the voter base and all this stuff, you can have whatever reality you want, right? It's not going to be the message. The message is the message. It's different. And I even would ask you this question here. America values freedom, right? If you ask the average American what makes America great and unique, they'd say freedom. It's like, okay. America also leads the world in incarcerated citizens per capita. You're more likely to be locked in a cage in America than any other country in the world. Until recently, El Salvador surpassed because they locked up a third of the country, right? That's a unique case. It's not because America became more lenient. That's not why. That's an oxymoron, is it not? Can you have a country that truly values freedom and also leads the world at locking people in cages? And it leads me to say that American freedom is just the most effective branding campaign that the world's ever seen. But on the street, it's anything from it. What's your take on that, Scott?
Well, I'm torn. I mean, you obviously have a good point. There is a hell of a lot of freedom still here. I've never lived all around the world. I don't know exactly how to compare it to the way all other people live and all that kind of thing. But I know that, if nothing else, it's the land of opportunity where you really can strike it rich and then keep your money, and the warlords will tax a certain percentage of it away. But essentially you can trust that the security situation is going to be stable enough. You're going to be able to hang on to your money, even deposit it in somebody else's institution, and be able to, have that stability, and the ability to control more money than you can keep on your person. You know what I mean? And rely on it. So there is a lot of that. And depending on who you are and where you are, you might never have to deal with the cops or regulators in any kind of particular way. And I think, when people complain about police abuse and prosecutorial abuse, a lot of times you have entire segments of the population who are like, I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? It's that famous Richard Pryor bit where he's like, you white folks, you're like, oh, hi, Officer Timpson. Are you going bowling this Thursday? See you there. And then, but like to black people, it's just different. It's like, bank just got robbed. N-word look just like you. Yeah. And then, full body cavity search and all this on the side of the road. And then, sweetheart, I don't really even feel like going out tonight, dude. Let's just go ahead and go home. Like, it's just a different experience depending on who you are and where you are. And it's not really as much a race thing as it is a class thing. If people have the ability to defend themselves, or if they're even wealthy enough, like upper middle class enough, that they might be related to a judge or a state senator or something like that, then cops tend to go easy, right? People do cocaine on the west side of Austin. The police don't do cocaine raids on the west side of Austin. They do cocaine raids in East Austin, where nobody's got any juice and nobody's going to get in any trouble for getting anybody in trouble. And I think people understand that that's really the way it works. And I know from just being a punk ass kid and getting pulled over by the cops all the time, because probably most of those really were my fault or whatever. But I remember going, spent many an hour in the waiting room at municipal court. And I would just go up to people and be like, so what did you do? What are you doing here? And it was always some petty BS, either something they didn't really do at all or some ridiculous fine or fee. And now they're losing their job because they have to spend all day Wednesday afternoon sitting down at the damn municipal court waiting for hours and hours and hours to even be called to have to deal with their thing. And their boss won't put up with it. So now they don't have a job anymore and this kind of thing. And it's just the oppression tax on poor people in this country. You might think, and you can see why they do think a lot of times, you'll hear especially poor black people say, the system is designed to prevent us from ever not being poor, right? This is designed to keep us in this place, right? Because there's always going to be an endless amount of fines and fees and tickets and whatever it is. And it's just, it can be impossible to get out from under that. If you're on a low wage fixed income, you're making a couple of grand a month. Half of that is your rent. The rest is food if you're lucky. And then, now you're on probation and you have to pay probation fees and you have to take off every third Tuesday to go down there and take a class on alcoholism, which is not a problem that you have. And all of these things, like, it's just madness. I knew a dude who got busted with some weed. He was my old weed dealer in high school. Got busted with a couple of pounds of weed. If he had just gone to prison, he'd have been out in 6 months. Instead, he took the deal and he was in and out of prison. He ended up doing like 3 or 4 years in prison, plus all the probation classes, all the probation fines and fees. And then they end up revoking him and sending him to prison anyway for missing one alcoholism class or whatever it is, right? And like, it's just like that, man. It sucks. Like, once they got their claws into you and you're part of the system, you've been convicted of any felony, whether it has anything to do with actually committing a crime against another person at all or not, but even just a certain quantity of contraband in your possession or unlicensed gun in your possession or whatever like this. Once they got their hooks into you, you can really suffer at the hands of the American state. And this is, to me, is so frustrating about these damned, George Sorosian progressive prosecutors come and, immediately, like every libertarian has been demanding whatever, we wouldn't call it this because we know better, right? But some sort of reform of the criminal justice system because of just how completely unrepentantly screwed up it is. Like, for example, no one gets a jury trial. They just threaten you with so many decades in prison that you plead guilty to something. It's like 90% of cases or 90+% of cases. That's not how it's supposed to be. If they would repeal a whole hell of a lot of the laws, making offenses out of things that are nothing, then they could actually prosecute the crimes and give people fair process. But you have people doing years in the pen after they confess to a crime that they didn't commit because it was either that or have essentially zero chance at trial. They will not get a fair trial like on Matlock on TV or whatever. They'll get completely screwed at trial. And now they're facing 30 years and never see their family again. And that's a life sentence. It's really bad. And then the progressive prosecutors come and what do? They legalize armed robbery and murder and rape. What? We had 1,000 fines and fees and offenses that needed to be lifted. And they legalize real crime, which is the one and only thing that we ever wanted the police to do. You take the armed robber and you hang that guy. Right? You take the murderer, you hang those guys, you put them in prison, leave everybody else the hell alone. But that never even occurred to them. They go, well, it's just not fair that more black people are prosecuted for murder than white people. Well, pardon me, we're talking about individuals who either did or didn't commit a murder here. But they're like, no, these laws against murder are enforced with a racial bias. So instead of prosecuting more white murderers, let's prosecute fewer black ones? Or like, I don't know what it would take to be liberal. I can't imagine how any person could exist on the political left and I would have the most splitting of headaches. I don't know how they deal with the dissonance of like, yeah, we're reforming the law. Yes, we're persecuting more poor people for offenses than ever before. But we're letting the murderers and the rapists and the armed robbers go, so at least there's progress there.
You just mentioned something that stuck with me when you said, I can't imagine effectively how a liberal can exist with that mindset and thought process. And it struck me as like, we're at this place where the divisions between call it the left and the right, although I honestly hate those terms. I feel quite politically homeless personally, but there's definitely irrevocable differences that have become entrenched in culture, and they deepen with every election cycle, and the pendulum swings harder and harder and harder, and we could expect it to continue to do so. So you could look at that scenario and say every year, every 5 years, these divisions become greater. The ability to communicate between parties becomes less. And this is a one-way street that ends in a really bad place. However, I asked that same question to the former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, who grew up during the political violence in the 60s. And he's like, yeah, look, this populism divide looks really bad. And it is. It's very serious and severe. And it's going to go worse before it gets better. But we've also been in a worse place in the past. He's like, I grew up and political leaders were actually being assassinated in the US. This is, so relative to that, although it feels very irrevocable today, irreconcilable today, we've come back from worse. So what's your take? And you got guys like Ray Dalio now calling for the probability of a civil war to be over 50%, I think was his latest. How do you make a claim like, or a forecast like that? But anyways, what's your take on that scenario, Scott?
Yeah. Well, if you're in the markets, bet against that guy. That's not right. Look, I
may have that wrong. I just want my audience will fact check. Maybe he's at 30%. Either way, just
whatever. Yeah. No, I don't think that's right. I mean, look, it's going to be town versus country in all 50 states. Right. It's not like we have a north-south divide here.
Right.
And all the liberals from the cities are going to march out to enslave the right-wingers in the countryside, or all the right-wing militias are all going to sack the city council building and take over all the downtowns? Or like, no, you could have where things really deteriorate. You would have what? You'd have assassinations and kidnappings and crime and all that. But that's what the FBI counterintelligence and counterterrorism and whatever units are for. That was why Hoover built them in the first place, was to absolutely squelch any kind of violent dissent, especially from the far right and the far left in this country. And the FBI are a lot of things, including child killers and liars and murderers. But are they completely incompetent at framing up and wrapping up right-wingers and left-wingers? No, I would not say that. You know what I mean? They can look at what they did to these, kind of pseudo militia guys in Michigan. The snap of our fingers, they made it look like they were going to try to kidnap and murder the governor and put him in the pen. Most of them, or at least some of them. So we're not headed that way. But the thing is, in all the frustration that you're seeing where people are moving further to the left and to the right, it is a very negative consequence. Again, I pin it all on the empire first. It's the heart of the corruption of the American empire, and the heart of the empire is the heart of the corruption of the American economy, and the rigged game for a few at the expense of the rest of us. And it gives what we call American capitalism a very bad name when it's so tied up with all this cronyism. And unfortunately, as people move further to the left and the right, the good news is they're more and more populist, right? They're less and less elitist, and they're more and more looking at what it's like to be a regular working person out in the world, making less than $100,000 a year and or maybe much less than that, and trying to figure out how to survive. But then when you move further to the left and the right, your economics get dumber. Just like obviously, I think in this conversation, the idiocy of socialism mostly goes without saying. We already touched at it in terms of China and all that. But I can hear Harry Brown, the little angel on my shoulder, call it what it is. It's national socialism. That's what this is, to have this national economic policy, all these tariffs and all these interventions and all these things. We are not supposed to be doing this, but it becomes more and more acceptable to people because they can see the absolute corruption of the Bill Clinton, George W. Bush centrist way. And so they want to move further to the left and further to the right, thinking that, and I've heard, he's my good buddy now, no offense, but Tucker Carlson is like, well, blame libertarianism for America's economic problems. Because in a way, you do have that Milton Friedman, at least, kind of influence that's focusing more on free markets, right? Again, like a Bill Clinton, W. Bush way, rather than like real Rothbardian libertarianism or anything like that. But, in other words, for one major example, freer trade under NAFTA and GATT and all of that and the WTO, freer than before. And then you see all these negative economic consequences for the people and make a direct connection. And there is somewhat of a connection, right? When you have the government working so hard to help companies offshore, and then they refuse to repeal the regulations and the taxes that are really encouraging them to do so. It's really been a national economic project to deindustrialize the country, right? Newt Gingrich ran as a Trumpian, or, tried to act as a Trumpian populist, trying to reverse all this. But he was the guy that wrote the foreword to the Toffler's book in the 90s about the third wave and how we needed to completely deindustrialize the country and just teach everyone to code. It'll be fine. We don't need to make anything anymore. We'll have the Chinese make everything for us, and we'll just be intellectual based economy, right? Intellectual property based economy entirely, right? Like that was the idea. This wasn't let's allow free markets to work. This was let's make it this way with this central planning. Now they're trying to central plan it back the other way again, right? Instead of just allowing free markets to reign. So the good news is the attitude is more populist. The bad news is the economics are more socialist. When what we actually really need is libertarianism. What we really need is not to move further to the left or to the right, but further to the freedom, further to the free market, and get rid of all the taxes and regulations that are bogging down American business, that make it financially difficult, if not impossible, to run factories here, and that gives so many companies the incentive to want to offshore. And let's see if they'll just come back instead of forcing them to come back. I've seen this over and over. I don't read the business press nearly enough, but I read it enough. I have enough. I've seen just over and over again where companies talk about, man, we're moving to Indonesia, but it's only by 1 percentage point or 2 percentage points. Like, God dang, if you guys would just lift a few of the regulations off of our neck, we wouldn't have to leave. But we do. We just cannot break a profit or break even, the way that you've got us now, but just a little bit less tax and a little bit less regulation, and we'd be able to stay. But, oh well, sayonara, and then they go. And so, again, if people would just follow Ron Paul's best advice, the guy that everyone agrees now was right about everything the whole time, all along, with no exceptions. Yeah. What he said was just have faith in freedom. We don't need a new national economic policy of one kind or another. We need a new lack of one, and let the companies sink or swim on their own. Again, if a company, for example, has been on U.S. government welfare through various means and has an artificially boosted price and value on the market now, and they have to suffer in the crash, that's okay. The only way to free markets from statism is toward them. And it might be even innocent people get hurt in the thing, but that's a consequence of rigging the game in the first place. Yeah. But whatever actual useful assets those companies have, they'll get bought up at bankruptcy court by somebody else, right? The actual wealth doesn't cease to exist. The actual inventions don't cease to exist. It's just, whether they're economically viable for another company to pick up and run with or not.
100%. And you have to let those deaths occur. I mean, what's the analogy? Science advances one funeral at a time. It's because we have to fail to learn, and then iterate and build again. The same is true in business. I completely agree with you. Scott, I want to point to your books because I'm just amazed, actually, at the cadence with which you write. And the depth at which you go. But your most recent book, Provoked, I'd love to hear about it today. And we can touch on enough already. Fool's Errand, Hotter Than the Sun. I wanted to jump into Hotter Than the Sun. We were talking about the sort of arms race and the nukes that are being used as leverage. But walk me through your mission behind your work. Like, why are you writing these books? You go deeper into this subject matter, foreign relations, than probably anybody. What's behind it? What drives you?
Well, I don't know. I guess it's just my comparative advantage in the thing. You know, as I said, I was kind of a New World Order kook in the 90s. So that meant, even though I was wrong about the grand design of a merger with Russia, I sure did learn a lot about the real history of the 20th century. And right, like the center of the conspiracy of the old John Birch conspiracy is the Rockefellers' Council on Foreign Relations. That's the secret government behind the evil plan. Well, wait, what is it again? The Council on Foreign Relations. Why? Because America's relationship with the rest of the world is the single most important determining factor in its own form and the national government that we have to deal with here at home. And so that was always their focus, I think, for good reason, that as long as we have this activist government overseas, of course, we have an activist government here at home. We would have to get rid of the illegitimate part of it, the completely illegitimate foreign part of it first. Then we could argue that the rest of these agencies are not befitting a limited republic. They do work with a world empire. They're necessary parts of a world empire, maybe, but they wouldn't fit with a constitutional republic. So that was kind of my whole basis of my interest in foreign policy in the first place, is understanding that America's role in the world is the most important determining factor in its relationship with us here inside the country as well. Mm-hmm. And then when I was a kid, Bill Clinton was the president, and all he ever did was murder people and lie about it, support terrorists and cause terrorist attacks, and was just absolutely horrible. Bombed Iraq on average every other day for 8 years, and the horrific starvation blockade that it was enforced from bases in Saudi Arabia that helped turn America and Britain and Saudi Arabia's Al-Qaeda mercenary terrorists against the United States, and kick off our whole, horrible terror war and all of that stuff. And then when W. Bush came, I mean, I was a cab driver at the time, and as I said, I was a New World Order kook and whatever. And so I may have been a kook, but I was a pretty smart one, and I was able to, extrapolate out in a way that other people I could see just around me could not tell. To me, this is the most obvious thing in the world, and they did not know that Governor Bush is going to be a war president. He is going to take us to war in his first term. He is going to invade Iraq 100%. He'll probably have to allow a terrorist attack in order to justify it. And then we're going to Iraq. Because look, his dad lost after one term with Saddam Hussein still in power over there. It's a Bill Hicks joke and everything. It's the ultimate humiliation for the Bush family. And now you're going to have a President Bush who in his first term is going to go to Iraq. So because he cannot possibly take the risk that he would lose after one election, after one term, with Saddam Hussein still in the chair some more again, just like his dad. So we are going to war. And nobody else seemed to understand that. I told people that in my cab from I told this story before. It's true. The day that W. Bush announced he was also running for governor, just like his brother Jeb in Florida, I told my math teacher, I was in 10th grade, and I told my math teacher, you see what's going on here? They're making sure that one of the two will be a second term governor so he can run for president in the year 2000, and then we're going back to Iraq. Guarantee.
This is when you're in grade 10.
In 10th grade, told Jane, the math teacher, that. And this is the most obvious thing in the world. So, and then, I was really interested in all this stuff. And then I started reading antiwar.com in 2002. I had read it before in 99. I knew it existed, and I knew it was owned by libertarians, but I really wasn't on the internet. I was just driving a cab, and I was paranoid enough about all of this stuff that I just wanted to live off the grid and not really be surveilled on the internet all day the way everybody else was. And I was trying to stay away from all of that. But then by 2002, it was like, no, look, first of all, I can't just keep driving a cab forever. I got to get, my act together and figure out what I'm really going to do for a living. And then W. Bush is lying us into war with Iraq. And I start reading antiwar.com, and the head writer there was a guy named Justin Raimondo. Now, he died back in 2019, so your audience may not be familiar with him, but man, was he a brilliant genius. He's basically a big gay Archie Bunker, if you could picture like a Pat Buchananite from Queens, only moved to San Francisco. But that's Justin, and he was, I remember when I started reading him that I just would always ask myself, how does this guy know all this stuff? He was just so plugged in, and a big part of it was because, as I was just learning, that the libertarians were the long-time avowed enemies of the neoconservatives. That our movement and theirs were sort of kissing cousins in a way, where we had agreed on the new left and agreed on civil rights and on affirmative action and this kind of thing. And, in the 60s, the liberals, the left became more statist. Well, hell, even with Karl Marx, right? The left became more statist even than the conservatives. So libertarians oftentimes end up allies with conservatives against the overreach of the left. And at least conservatives are nominally free market property rights, gun owning folk. Whereas, the leftists make no such pretense of those things, right? So we have these kind of alliances. But the problem is the neoconservatives, they were a bunch of ex-communists. They never really believed in the things that we believed in. Bill Kristol's father, Irving, wrote a book called Two Cheers for Capitalism, right? That was their whole thing. They're essentially centrists. They're like W. Bush guys. They came from the left, but then they never moved further to the right than W. Bush. That is one hair to the right of center, right? And of course, they're the vanguard of the war party on behalf of Israel. But the libertarians, in their original generations, they came from a lot of the same social classes and the same kind of groups and universities and think tanks as some of these guys. They all kind of knew each other. The WASPs at the CFR wouldn't let the Jews and the Catholics in. But the libertarians and the neoconservatives were largely Jews and Catholics, right? So they all kind of knew each other. They were like upper middle class guys who went to college and were intellectuals, but they weren't born real rich, right? They weren't Rockefeller types, and they weren't like the waspy wasps in the Brooks Brothers, whatever thing that you had to be part of to fit in with the old dominant wasp culture. And that was really just kind of spent and running out after Vietnam. But anyway, so they all kind of knew each other and they hated each other. And so Murray Rothbard, for example, there's this hilarious article called I Hate Max Lerner. And he goes, I hated Max Lerner when he was a Stalinist, and I hated Max Lerner when he was a Trotskyite, and I hated Max Lerner when he was a Shockmanite, and I hate Max Lerner now that he's a Reaganite. And then he goes on and on and on about, that's the great Murray Rothbard. So this is the tradition that Justin came from. Was he knew every single one of these neoconservatives' names, their intellectual pedigree, why their father was a communist, and where they all came from, and why we should all hate them so much, in a way where I just did not know. I thought a Republican was James Baker III. Again, the WASP from the family of Sith Lords, right? The lawyer for Exxon. That's the Republican establishment, right? Nope. It's Israel's fifth column. That's the real Republican establishment now. It's the neoconservatives. Forget all this Carol Quigley crap, all this John Birch crap about the New World Order and the Rockefellers and the building up the United Nations. That's not what this is about. This is about Likud using and abusing the American people to destroy all their enemies for them to create a greater Israel, or the Likud party, essentially. And that was exactly what was up. And Justin just knew. And when I started reading Justin, I knew very quickly that I was wrong about what's going on here. This guy obviously knows what's going on here. And, I guess I could say became a very close disciple of his. And I ended up working for antiwar.com, became his assistant editor, essentially filling his articles with links 3 days a week, making sure he was right about everything. And I would encourage anybody, just find you, maybe it's middle of August is a bad way to put it, but find you a rainy Sunday and lock yourself inside and just read everything Justin Raimondo ever wrote for antiwar.com, starting in 1999. And read through all of his Kosovo articles and everything in the lead up to Afghanistan, all of his stuff on the Balkan Wars, and then Afghanistan, Iraq War II, and all the rest of the terror wars, at least through W. Bush and at least through like the first half of Barack Obama. There's no question in my mind that Justin Raimondo was the most important writer in America. And for everybody who missed out, they missed out. This was the guy who knew more, understood most and best about America's wars and the neocons who were lying us into war for Israel and why and all that stuff. So once I started palling around with the antiwar.com guys, and then, I'm an interview show. I've done 6,000 interviews since 2003. So that was really what I started doing. I was a radio guy anyway. I just sit up here. You can see how I am. I just sit here and complain for 12 hours a day. I don't care. But then I thought, what I need to do is I need to start interviewing the guys that they run at antiwar.com and really learning the most about them. And then the plan was, hopefully if I interview enough of them, eventually I'll be one of them. And people maybe listen to what I have to say instead too. And then, so that was basically the plan. And then it is and I agree with Justin about this. And his great hero was Garrett Garrett, who I already mentioned, who said everything goes out and nothing comes back. He had written the great book, The People's Pottage and Defend America First. And he said, it was Garrett Garrett who said, I'm going to very poorly quote this, but it was something like, between a Republican form of government that is limited, constitutional, and empire, there is mortal enmity. One system must either forbid the other or will destroy it. And so that's the story of essentially the American Republic, right? It blew its own brains out, right? Just like in Star Wars. The Republic didn't get conquered by the Empire. The Republic abandoned freedom and became the Empire. And that's, of course, Lucas, the movie was about us. People don't really get that, but that was what it was about. It wasn't about the Soviet Union. It was about the United States and what we had done. And so that was basically my thing. Once I fell in with the guys from antiwar.com, I just, I still am interested in all these other subjects, law and order, and to a lesser degree, I guess, immigration. I'm more interested in that issue now, but like, obviously I'm into Austrian school economics, hard money, and I love beating everyone over the head with why the business cycle is actually the government inflationary money boom and bust cycle, as taught by Mises 100 years ago. The world's time to catch up now with that. So I have all those other interests too, but I think where I have a comparative advantage is in the foreign policy stuff. And I think now, as far as you asked me about why write these books, my friend Cornbread told me for years that I needed to write a book. Man, you need to write a book about all this stuff. I never really knew where to begin or what to do or exactly what I wanted to say. I got a lot to say, but I didn't know exactly what I want to say. And then Tom Woods came to me and goes, listen, dude, let's do a book together, and it'll be like the War on Terrorism for Dummies, and we'll just have a little bit on each of the wars. I go, oh yeah, bet. Of course, that makes perfect sense. So I wrote him an outline in like 15 minutes. Here's what we're going to say. And then I just wrote the thing. And poor Tom, he had other jobs. And then, so I started writing enough already. Then I got stuck on chapter 2, Afghanistan. And so chapter 2 became Fool's Errand. My first book was just about Afghanistan. Then I went back and I started over and did enough already, keeping Afghanistan short and sweet, and then moving on with the rest. And then, so that has the rest of all the terror wars: Iraq, Libya, Mali, Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, whatever, all in there. And then Provoked is it's essentially the same motive here, is that because I hate writing books. I'm really not an author. I'm a radio guy. There are people, and I read enough. I know what it is to read a talented writer. I am not that. I'm a names and dates guy. Like, okay, I'm good at names and dates. Like, as far as being a writer, I'm really not. I would much rather just do radio and podcasting and things. But the reason I wrote the books is because I figured that I really do have a comparative advantage at this point, where in my mind's eye, I can tell you one story all the way through. I don't know if you saw the Tucker Carlson interview, but that was like me doing enough already, basically in one take. We'll start with 1953, explain how that led to 79. Here's a bunch of things that happened in 79, Afghanistan, the obviously the Iranian Revolution, and then in 1980, the Iran-Iraq War, and how the Iran-Iraq War led to Iraq War I, and how Iraq War I led to Iraq War I.5, where Bill Clinton decided to stay in Saudi Arabia for 8 years, the rise of Al-Qaeda and their war against us. Then we get to September 11th, and Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, Iraq War III, and Yemen. And it's just, essentially at that point, it's just chronology. But I guess what it is I have read so much about all of these things, so many books and so many articles about all of these things. And I thought that essentially I hadn't seen anyone put it together in one causal chain all the way through the way I thought I could. And there are a couple of, like, in the timeline in my head, there are a couple of important pieces that people seem to usually miss that to me are crucial. I'll give you just one example. Is after Iraq War I, there was the Shiite and Kurdish uprising against Saddam Hussein's rule that was encouraged by the United States. George Bush Sr. went on Voice of America radio and encouraged the Iraqi army divisions to turn on Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein. They dropped leaflets over the army divisions as well. But then what happened was they changed their mind, and they let Saddam Hussein keep his tanks and attack helicopters and kill 100,000 people to put down the insurrection. Why? Like, I always knew that was important, and everybody knew it was important. And it was a major part of then America's excuse to stay in Saudi Arabia after driving Iraq out of Kuwait. Well, now we have to stay to protect the Shiites and the Kurds from Saddam, as though he was just going to keep killing them all when the insurrection had been crushed, right? It was silly. But that became the excuse. But then what I finally figured out, I finally read a thing that explained, it was because the Badr Brigade, the militia of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, they were coming across the border from Iran. They were the Iraqi traitors who chose Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war, even fought on Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war. Now they are coming to inherit the revolution. So you see, from Bush Sr.'s point of view, because he was Reagan's vice president, his entire cabinet, other than Dick Cheney, had been in Reagan's government. So these were literally the men who had just spent 8-9 years backing Saddam Hussein to contain the Shiite Iranian revolution. Now they are the ones importing it, and they are going to help the Iranians men sack Baghdad. And they go, oh no, and that was why they choked. And that was why they let Saddam Hussein keep his tanks and helicopters and crush the insurrection. And then that became the reason they had to stay in Saudi Arabia. So it was little things like that, where to me, that was the piece of the puzzle that I needed to be able to tell that complete story through in a way that, like, not just that it makes sense, that you can follow me what I'm telling you, but so that you and I both understand that, guess what? 8 years later, when W. Bush went to Baghdad, guess who he took to power with him on his heels? The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq and their Badr Brigade militia. And that's who rules Iraq to this day. That's who we fought Iraq War II for, was the same people that Bush's father had betrayed in 1991. And for good reason, right? When he shouldn't have encouraged them to uprise, he shouldn't have done that war at all. But anyway, he shouldn't have encouraged Saddam to invade Kuwait, of all the things he shouldn't have done. But so that was why I decided to write it, is because I thought I can tell this story as one story all the way through in a way that I think is, and maybe it's because I'm a libertarian and at least I would never claim to be an economist, but I'm like under the influence of the Austrian school, right? So for me, every question about public policy or any social problem of any kind always begins with, why is this the U.S. government's fault in the first place? We always ask that first before we ask what solution do they have to bring to bear, because 99% of the time or better, the real solution is just to make them stop doing the stupid damn thing they did in the first place to make it this way, rather than double down and triple down and try to correct the problem that they caused. So if it's the same with economics, like for example, why do we have a giant illegal immigration problem? Because big business needs illegal immigration because it's the inflation fighter. Because big business's biggest problem of overhead is wages. So when the government prints money all day and the government licenses banks to print money all day and they destroy the currency, creating massive upward pressure on wages, then big business demands that the Democrats let 100 million people into the country to work illegally to drive down that upward pressure on wages, when what we needed was gold money in the first place. If we didn't have inflationary money, we wouldn't need the inflation fighter in all those illegal immigrants, would we? Right? And so that's how you answer the question of illegal immigration. How about we stop printing money? How about we lift our sanctions on Venezuela? How about we stop insisting on militarized drug wars in Mexico? How about we stop doing all the things our government is doing to cause the crisis in the first place, rather than what's Trump's solution? Declare war against the cartels and double and triple down on the same problem. So it's the same thing here. And that's my analysis of the Middle East. This is all Jimmy Carter's fault. Every bit of it. Him and everybody in power who came after him, who did nothing but make stupid decisions, right? Especially W. Bush, but especially all of them. They just ruined everything. And you could say, oh, Saddam was bad. I don't care. Washington, D.C. is 1,000 times more sinful and criminal than Baghdad could ever be. And when it was the most criminal regime in the world, it was under American occupation.
Right.
You know, simple as that.
Yeah.
So
we just did a piece covering the sort of rise in poppy production and opium refinery growth during the American occupation of Afghanistan, which, is a whole another thread. But, I feel like it's very optimistic that you are appearing on some of the biggest platforms in the world, Lex Fridman, Tucker Carlson, et cetera, because of, what's behind your books is like you're a truth teller, right? That's the intention here. And Provoked, Not Justified, your most recent book, which directly disputes the most common headline and rationale that everybody was sold about the Russia-Ukraine war, the unprovoked invasion, all of this. That's why you titled your book Provoked. Let's just actually be real about this. Provoked, Not Justified being the full title. Both those things are true, not exclusive. Even with I'm not foolish enough to think any politician is altruistic at their core, but I do think the message that was behind Trump's presidency was one of deregulation. And people bought into that. No, I don't know that he's delivering on that. I would question it. Maybe certain pockets, right? It's not the binary thing, right? There are certain segments where absolutely that is the case. But the point is, that's what people voted for. Whether or not he delivers on it, the people are beginning to understand that's what's in their best interest, right? And I think that actually goes tandem with platforms like yours gaining more notoriety today because people are looking for ways to cut through the noise and get to the signal and understand the incentives behind global developments, not the narrative. You understand the incentives, things make a lot more sense. Whether or not you agree with the incentives, most of the time you probably won't. But Scott, I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for coming on the show. Congratulations on the books. Again, I'm just sort of in awe. They're massive undertakings, and the cadence with which you write. Thanks again, man. It's been a fun conversation.
Thank you very much. It's been good to be with you.
All right.
You will not hear this from most financial advisors, and in fact, the traditional construction of most portfolios in Canada actually inhibits you from benefiting from these 10x stocks. You can find the next 10x stock in the most boring places. Boring, beautiful businesses that create great cash flow over the long term. We recommend this company at 60 cents today, trades at 116. That's 200x where we originally recommended it. Boyd Group, traded at $2.30. Today, about $2.22, about 10,000%. If you had 20 stocks in that portfolio, all other 19 companies could have literally went to zero in that portfolio, and you'd still have a tremendous return. You really find the companies, the next 10x stocks, in a down market. When everybody is looking away, when there's blood in the streets, that's a great time to buy. We're looking to make money in the market over the long term. You just need to find a boring, beautiful business that produces returns. The returns to me are sexy, not the situation or the story that you're invested in.